How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Memvav, Daf 46 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, there are 3 sections to today's Daf. We finish off the Mishnah that we are in the middle of, that I guess we began yesterday, and we will get up to the final Mishnah of Perek Beis Shammai, of the 4th Perek of Masechta Zevachim. The first section of today's daf discusses blood's exclusion from noser and tamei. If you will recall from the Mishnah that we learned towards the end of the daf yesterday, we had said that, we had recently been listing things that are exceptions to pigul, things like a kometz or the mincha of a kayin, for example. Things that pigul does not apply to. So we had learned yesterday that of these things that pigul does not apply to, noser and tamei do apply to them. So if one would eat them when they are in a state of being left over past their time that they were supposed to be offered or eaten, I reckon, or if the person became tamei, or if they became tamei, so tuma and noser would still apply to these things, like the komets, like the minchas kayin or the minchas chavitin, etc. Now, the Mishnah had said, however, that an exception to that rule is dam, is blood. That blood, the noser and tamei do not apply to blood. That's the first section of today's daf. Is how do we know that blood is excluded from, of course, pigul, but also from noser and from tamei. Next, we will discuss inedible and impure kodesh. Also in the Mishnah that we learned yesterday, we saw a machlokas between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon with regard to things like frankincense, for example. If a person, so this is going to be part of the discussion, are we talking about if the person's tamei or if the frankincense is tamei? But if one would eat frankincense, for example, which is something that is not normally eaten, but somebody were to eat that in a state of tumah, so it was a machlokas between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon about if they would be chayiv for that or potter. So we will discuss that, and then we will get to a new Mishnah, the final Mishnah of Perek Beis Shammai, that discusses Bigalo, which is interesting. It's going to be a throwback to really the very, very beginning of Masechta Zevachim. Right, shinui kodesh, shinui bailim, not at the same level of intensity by any means. Those were very intense topics and intense dafs. But we are going to have a shtickle throwback to those sugyas. The topic of the Mishnah is the proper intention for a Korbin. So friends, this is what we have in store for today's daf. It's going to be mamash gevalt. Let us jump in. Friends, we are going to begin on Daf Memvav Amud Aleph, 2 lines into the Amud. Here we go. Chutz min adam chulei. So as I explained in the introduction, in the Mishnah that we learned, Amud Beis, we had said that all of the exceptions to pigul, the things that would not be pigul, are relevant, however, to noser and to tamei. We said the exception to that being blood. That, of course, you slaughter an animal, there's blood. So if one were to eat that blood, so you'd be chayiv for eating blood, okay, that if it was on purpose, you'd be chayiv kares. If it was by accident, there's a chiyuv chatos. If you were tamei, or if the blood was tamei, you would not additionally be chayiv for being tamei. Also, if it was noser, if it was left over, I imagine, what does that mean in the context of blood? Maybe if it came to shkia and it was just kind of, maybe if you ate the blood after shkia, maybe? I don't know. Anyways, you wouldn't be chayiv for noser anyways. How do we know this? How do we know that noser and tamei are not relevant to blood? That's the question. Menonymity. How do we know this? Amar Ula says, Ula Amar Kra, that the pasuk says. Now it's very interesting. We're going to see a discussion now, not about noser or about tamei, but about me'ilah. We're going to see a discussion now about me'ilah, about getting benefit from blood that is kodesh, right? Once it's been received in the klisharis, it becomes kodesh kedushas haguf. So, or maybe even once it's part of the animal, once it's part of a korbin already, you can't get benefit from it. So we are going to, so we're going to discuss me'ilah in the context of blood, and at the end of the discussion about me'ilah, where me'ilah is of course the prohibition against getting benefit from kodesh, at the end of the discussion of me'ilah, we're going to tie it into noser and to tamei. So, how do we know this? Ula says, the pasuk says, "Va'ani nasativ lochem." Right, this is in the context of blood. Right, I'll read you the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ki nefesh habaser badam he," that the soul of the meat is in the blood. Va'ani nasativ lochem al mizbeach, and I gave it to you. So lochem. Okay, we're going to see three different drushes. One comes from lachem. I gave it to you. Al mizbeach lichaper, to atone. That's going to be another drusha from atone. Al nafshosechem ki adamu, who is going to be a third drusha. Banefesh yichaper. Right. So again, it says ki nefesh. So the soul of the meat is in the blood, and I gave it to you on the altar to atone on your souls, because the blood atones for the soul. Givaldik. That is a pasuk in the context of the blood of a Korbin. Now, let's start again. How do we know that by dam there's no tumah and there's no noser? There's no iser tumah, no iser noser. Ma'ula says, the pasuk says, by the blood of a Korbin. Bani nesativ lochem, I gave it to you. Lochem shelachem yeh. It's yours. It's yours. Get benefit from it. No problem. There's not going to be me'ilah by the dam, by the blood of a Korbin. Shelachem, it's yours. Get benefit from it. No problem. Devei Rabbi Shmuel, they said by the Besmedrish Rabbi Shmuel Tana. The pasuk says lichaper, to atone. Lichaper nasativ v'lo leme'ilah. I gave you the blood of an animal for atonement, not for me'ilah. There won't be me'ilah if one gets benefit. If one benefits from the blood of a Korbin, there is no din me'ilah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kol, the pasuk says who? Right? It says ki adam hu banefesh yichaper. Hu lifnei kapara ki la'achar kapara. It is the same, just like before kapara, which I assume is talking about the zrikas adam, as well as after the zrikas adam. Ma'achar kapara, just like after the zrikas adam, ein bo me'ilah, there's no longer me'ilah. Rashi explains here, it says, the chayvan delays be sutzorech gavoa lo korin be kodesh Hashem, right? Since after the zrikas adam, there's no longer any need for the blood for any holy purposes. Therefore, it's no longer considered kodesh Hashem. So after the zrikas adam, there's no longer me'ilah. So ma'achar kapara ein bo me'ilah, just like after the zrikas adam, there's no longer me'ilah, there's no longer prohibition against benefiting from the blood once already the mitzvah of zrikas adam has been done. Af lifnei kapara ein bo me'ilah. So even before zrikas adam, there's no din of me'ilah, right? Who it is consistent, just like after zrikas adam, there's no me'ilah. Also before zrikas adam, there's no me'ilah. In fact, the Gemara suggests, wait, but maybe I'll say punkt fakert, maybe I'll say the other way around, meaning why don't we say fakert? That after zrikas adam is like before zrikas adam, and say ma lifnei kapara yesh bo me'ilah, and say, well, before zrikas adam there is me'ilah, la'achar kapara yesh bo me'ilah, and say also after zrikas adam there should also be me'ilah. Says the Gemara, that's an impossible suggestion, because there's no such thing as something that the mitzvah has already been done, and yet you could still violate me'ilah. No, there's no such thing. Once the mitzvah has been done, so kilu pre zrikas adam, when there's still mitzvah to be done with the blood, okay, so don't benefit from it. Once the mitzvah has been done, there's no longer prohibition of me'ilah. That's for sure. So therefore, says the Gemara, look, after zrikas adam, there's for sure no longer me'ilah. And if we're saying who, to say that it's consistent, what's going to have to be consistently that, just like after zrikas adam, there's no longer a din of me'ilah, so also before zrikas adam, there's no din of me'ilah. Vilo, Wait. Is that really so? That once the mitzvah has been done, there's no longer me'ilah. That's a rule. Once the mitzvah has already been done, there's no longer going to be me'ilah. Is that so? Very Trumas Hadeshin. What about Trumas Hadeshin? What's Trumas Hadeshin? Who could tell me what Trumas Hadeshin is? We learned a little bit about Trumas Hadeshin probably about a month ago or so. Of course, Trumas Hadeshin, we learned was the first avodah that would be done in the Beis HaMikdash every day. A kohen would go to the top of the Mizbeach and take a shovel full of the ashes from the top of the Mizbeach and then bring it down and put it next to the east of the kevesh, of the ramp of the Mizbeach. And then once it's been placed there to the east of the ramp, next to the ramp, so the mitzvah is done. Trumas Hadeshin is done. And yet, you're still not allowed to get benefit from the ashes. Right? They would be put there. I think at least I think according to one opinion, there was a miracle and it would kind of be like absorbed into the floor of the Azara. But you're not allowed to get benefit from those ashes even once the mitzvah is done, even once they've been placed on the floor. So Trumas Hadeshin seems to be an example of, even though the mitzvah has already been done, there's still a din of me'ilah. So again, vilo, is that right? I'll even back up one line. Right? Ein l'chadavar, you don't have any examples, shenaisa mitzvaso, that the mitzvah has already been done, mu'alin bo, and yet you could still be chayv milah. No examples. Vilo, no examples. Vari Trumas Hadeshin. Trumas Hadeshin is an example. Mishum dahave Trumas Hadeshin uvigdei kuna. Shnei ksuvin haboyin ke'echad v'shnei ksuvin haboyin ke'echad ein melamdin. Well, enochinami. Yes, Trumas Hadeshin, even once the mitzvah has been done, you can't get benefit from it. You're right. However, it's not the only example, right? As we learned, as we know, if ever there's just one example, you could make a binyanav, right? You could say, well, just like by Trumas Hadeshin, which is what the Gemara wants to suggest, just like by Trumas Hadeshin, even once the mitzvah has been done, me'ilah still applies. So we want to say, therefore, we should say that even in general, we could say once the mitzvah has been done, me'ilah still applies. However, Trumas Hadeshin is not the only example. There's another example, Big Day Kuna. What about Big Day Kuna, friends? What about Big Day Kuna? Friends, if you remember back to Masechta Yoma, to the Big Day Kuna of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, that when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would go into the Holy of Holies, would go into the Lifnai v'Lifnim on Yom Kippur, he would wear the white garment. He would not wear the Big Day Zav, these golden garments. He would wear Big Day Lavan, the white garments, the garments of a Kohen Hedjit. And the question is, what's the status of the Big Day Lavan after Yom Kippur? What happens to the clothing that were worn on Yom Kippur? So we want to say right now, so if you remember from Masechta Yoma, it's a machlokes between the Chachamim and Reb Dosa that we're going to see in the Gemara right now. That the Chachamim say that after Yom Kippur, the Big Day Lavan, the white garments that the Kohen Gadol wore lifnai v'lifnim into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the Chachamim's opinion is they're Asur Bano. So here's an example of Shenaisis Mitzvaso. Right, the Big Day Lavan, the mitzvah has been done. Right, Yom Kippur came and went. The Kohen Gadol wore them in the kodesh HaKodashim, lefnai v'lefnim. Their mitzvah has been done, and they're asur bahano. So therefore, says the Gemara, look, Trumas Hadeshin after the mitzvah has been done, asur bahano, but also Big Day Kahuna after the mitzvah, right? The Big Day Lavan of Yom Kippur after the mitzvah has been done, asur bahano. So because if we only had Trumas Hadeshin, so then we could say, okay, just like by Trumas Hadeshin, even after the mitzvah is done, it's also bano. So let's apply that more broadly and say that generally speaking, we could say that even after the mitzvah has been done, it's still also bano. But because you have Trumas Hadeshin, but also Big Day Lavan, so you have two examples where even though the mitzvah has been done, it's still asur bana. So we say, well, from the fact that the Torah is pointing out just those two instances, it's limited only to those two instances. If it was to be applied generally, it would just say in one instance, and we can apply it to all instances. But because it's written in specifically two places, we'll say it's only those two places, which is why the Torah specified those two places. It's only those two places and no other places. So therefore, we're saying, yes, Trumas Hadeshin, even after the mitzvah has been done, it remains also bano. However, and the big day lavan of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur, Shnei Ksuvin Haba and Ke'echad, are two examples of the same thing, right? Two examples of, even after the mitzvah has been done, they're also ba'na, B'chol Shnei Ksuvin Haba and Ke'echad ein melamdin, and whenever you have that scenario of two examples of something, you can't apply it broadly to other places, because we'll say, the Torah specified it in those two places because it's only those two places. Okay, well, that works according to the rabbis who actually hold, as I alluded to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that's all fine and good according to the rabbis who hold that the big day lavan after Yom Kippur are asur bahana. That the Kohen Gadol leaves the big day lavan there. They have to be stored away. You can't get any benefit from them anymore. But Ella l'Rab Dosa Damer. What about according to Rab Dosa? If you remember Rab Dosa's opinion from Masechta Yoma, Damer mutaros hein the kohen hedget. But according to Rab Dosa, who said a kohen hedget can still wear those big day lavan during the course of the year, no problem. You just can't reuse the big day lavan for another Yom Kippur, but a kohen hedget can use them. So according to Reb Dosa, you can get benefit from the big day lavan after they've been used in the kodesh kodashim. So once the big day lavan have already been worn lifnai v'lifnim on Yom Kippur, a kohen hedget can wear them. They just can't be used for another Yom Kippur. So if that's the case, it seems like we only have the example of Trumas Hadeshin, where after the mitzvah has been done, it's still asur. So why don't we say that just like by Trumas Hadeshin, after the mitzvah has been done, it's still asur banos. So let's say, in general, even after the mitzvah has been done, we could say that something else is still, we could say it's still asur banos. So Ma'ika Lememar, no. So what are we going to say? We seem to only have Trumas Hadeshin as an example. So Mishum David Trumas Hadeshin ve'egla arufa shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad v'chol shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad im lamdin. Well, okay, we have Trumas Hadeshin, but also egla arufa, right? When a corpse is found between hither and yon, we don't know who the murderer is, so we take a calf and we break its neck, and then afterwards that calf is asur ba'ana. So after the mitzvah has been done, after the egla has been arufad, it's still asur ba'ana. So we have Trumas Hadeshin and Egla Rufa as two examples that after the mitzvah has been done, they're asur ba'ana. And therefore it's limited to those two examples. But generally we would say after the mitzvah has been done, it is mutter ba'ana. Okay, that's all fine and good if you actually hold that when you have two examples of something, it's limited to only those two examples. However, it's actually a machlokas. There's another opinion. There is a dissenting opinion that holds that even when a particular halacha is specified in the Torah in just two places, we don't say it's limited to just those two places. We could still expand it broadly. So if that's the case, why don't we say, so I'll suggest that by blood, even after Zrikas Adam, it's still asur ba'ana. So trei mi'ut eksiva. Yeah, the thing is that there's an additional mi'ut, both by Trumas Hadeshin as well as by Egla Rufa. It says by Egla Rufa, ha arufa. That is this right? Ha the arufad. Meaning it's only by Egla Rufa is there this halacha that it's asur ba'ana even afterwards. V'asam ksiv v'samo, and by Trumas Hadeshin says, and you will place it again to say that this halacha of being asur ba'ana is limited only to it, to Trumas Hadeshin, but we would not broadly say that after a mitzvah has been completed, something would still be Asr Ba'ano. Okay, fine. So therefore, the blood, so that was a very long-winded way of explaining Rabbi Yochanan, who had said, who, right? The pasuk says, Ki Adam hu b'nefesh yichaper, and it is consistent before Zrikas Adam, after Zrikas Adam, and therefore after Zrikas Adam, it must be mutter bano, because the mitzvah has already been done, so therefore before Zrikas Adam, it's also mutter bano. So this was all in the context of Me'ilah. Now our Mishnah was talking about noser and tamei. So how is it relevant to our Mishnah? It's relevant because, now the Gemara asks, Vitlasa kroi bidam lamali. By blood, why did we need 3 sort of special magic words, special words? We had lachem, which is what Ula learned from. Tana Dever Bishmal learned from lechaper, and Rabbi Yochanan learned from who? Why do I need 3 of these kind of special words? Limute me'ila, mi me'ila, minoser, umitoma. The answer is because blood is excluded from 3 things. From me'ila, as we've been learning about, there's no me'ila by the blood. But also, there's no halacha of noser by the blood, nor is there an isser of tuma by the blood. So we see that there's lachem, there's lechaper, there is who, they're excluding me'ila, but also noser and tuma. So, our Mishnah said blood is excluded from noser and tuma. That's from here. Aval pigel lo tzarich kra. Now, we also said that blood is excluded from pigel. That didn't need a pasuk because the Tanam we learned in a Mishnah on Daf Mem Gimel. Kol sheyesh lo matirin bein la'adam bein la'mizbeach, anything that becomes permitted, whether to people, like to eat the meat of an animal, or to the mizbeach, like the emurin, chayav and olive mishum pigel, you'd be chayav for pigel v'dam, gufe matiru. But blood doesn't become permitted, it permits, right? In order for something to be chayav pigel, it has to be something that becomes permitted, like the meat of the Korbin, like the emurim to be burnt on the mizbeach. Blood doesn't become permitted, it's the permitter. That once the blood has been thrown on the mizbeach, now the meat becomes mutter to be eaten. Now the emurim become mutter to be put on the mizbeach. But the blood doesn't itself become mutter, and therefore it's not shaykh to bilai. So I don't need a pasuk to exclude blood from pigel, because conceptually pigel only applies to things that become mutter. Blood never becomes mutter, therefore it is not relevant to pigel. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan, shlosha kreses b'shlomim lama. Why does it say kares 3 times by a tamei person who eats shlomim? Now, there's 3 psukim, okay? Now, the first one doesn't necessarily say anything about shlomim, though. The first one just talks about right? So mikola kodshim asher yekdishu b'nei Yisrael v'tumaso alav v'nichrasa, etc. So it doesn't necessarily say anything about shlomim per se in the first pasuk. So I don't know why Rabbi Yochanan Dafka says, why does it say kares 3 times by shlomim? But anyways, okay. But the other two psukim do talk about shlomim. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan shlosha kreses b'shlomim lama. How come we have these 3 psukim that talk about if a person is tamei and eats kodshim or shlomim, they will be chayav kares. If a person's tamei and eats kodshim, they'll be chayav kares. So achas l'chla v'achas l'prat. Okay. Well, because the first pasuk, as I mentioned, doesn't actually say anything about shlomim per se, but the next pasuk does mention shlomim. So that's a klal u'prat. The truth is, it's not really a klal u'prat, as Rashi and Tosfos point out. It is a dover, right? If you say, we're really moving into korbanis over here in davening in the morning, right? Of course, tomorrow we're going to begin the parak of Ezehu Mekoman, and at the very end of Ezehu Mekoman we have Rabbi Shmuel Omer, and over there in Rabbi Shmuel Omer we say Dover Shahaya Bechlal V'Yotza Min HaKlal Lelamed Lo Lelamed Al Atzmo Yotza Ela Lelamed Al HaKlal Kulo Yotza. that when you have, so klal ufrat is generally like when you have one pasuk, and in that pasuk, it's talking broadly, then specific, and then if it talks broadly again, that would be klal ufrat, uchlal. This, however, is not in the same pasuk. These are different psukim in different places. So this isn't klal ufrat. This is so that we had this one pasuk that said if you eat kodshim in general when you're tamei, you'll be chayiv kares. But now we have a different pasuk in a different place that says if you eat a shlomim when you're tamei, you'll be chayiv kares. So you had now shlomim was part of the general rule by kodshim that if you're tamei, you'll be chayiv kares. Why was shlomim specified? So right, shlomim was included in the general rule. And he left the group to teach something. It's not just teaching about itself, but rather it's teaching about the prohibition against eating kodshim in a state of tumah in general. So, as Tosfos points out, if you look in the third and fourth lines of Tosfos, right? Basically, what it's saying is that just like, so meaning you have the klal, right? Don't eat kodshim in a state of tumah, or you'll be chayiv kares. Then it mentions specifically shlomim. So saying that just like shlomim is kodshim mizbeach, right? It's a Korbin as kedushas haguf, and it's offered in mizbeach. So this prohibition and this chiyuv kares will be by kodshim mizbeach to the exclusion of kodshim bedek habayis. Something that's only kedushas damim for the temple treasury, you would not be chayiv kares for eating that in a state of tumah. So achas leklal back in the Gemara. So one pasuk is talking about generally, v'achas leprat, and the next pasuk is talking about specifically shlomim, again to teach that it's dafka kodshim mizbeach as opposed to kodshim bedek habayis. V'achas ledvarim she'ein necholin, and the third pasuk is to say you'll be chayiv kares even for things that are not normally eaten, right? Back in our Mishnah, there was the machlokas between that we're going to get to for more in a few minutes. There was the machlokas in our Mishnah yesterday between the Tanna Kama, and as I mentioned, as I referred to in the introduction, there was machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon about what if you eat frankincense, for example. According to the Chacham, you will be chayiv. If you're tamei and you eat frankincense, you'll be chayiv. According to Reb Shimon, since frankincense is not something that you normally eat, you would not be chayiv for eating it in a state of tumah. So that third pasuk, according to the Chachamim, right? So we're saying, so va'achas l'dvarim she'ein necholin. That third pasuk is teaching that even for things that are not normally eaten, you would still be chayiv kares if you eat them in a state of tumah. Reb Shimon de Amar dvarim she'ein necholin ein chayiv nolem mishum tumah lisuyemai. What about according to Reb Shimon, though, who says that if you eat in a state of tumah things that are not normally eaten, so then you would not be chayiv for tumah. So then, what's the deal with the third pasuk? So the isuye chatos apnimios, says Reb Shimon, it is to say that you will be chayiv kares for eating the meat of inner chatoses in a state of tumah. Now, normally inner chatoses are not eaten in general, because they are entirely burnt. But if you were to eat it, you in a state of tumah, you'd be chayiv kares. I may have thought, Reb Shimon, since Reb Shimon says, Kol she'eino ha-mizbeach achitzon kishlomim ein chayiv nolav mishum pigul. Right? Of course, everybody remembers Reb Shimon's shita is that pigul only applies to korbanos whose blood is thrown on the mizbeach achitzon. However, chatos apnimios, that their blood is thrown on the mizbeach apnimi, says Reb Shimon, pigul does not apply to chatos apnimios. So mishum tuma nami lo l'chayiv. So I may have thought that according to Reb Shimon, just like pigul is not shaykh to chatos apnimios, so maybe therefore also tuma is not shaykh to chatos apnimios kamash malan. So according to Reb Shimon, that third pasuk is coming to teach that even by chatos apnimios, if one were to eat it in a state of tuma, there will be a chiyuv kares. And now we move on to the last section of the Mishnah from yesterday, and we discussed the machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon about inedible and impure kodesh, right? And as we've been discussing also in the last few minutes, that when you have something like, for example, frankincense, which is not eaten, but somebody does eat it in a state of tumah, and we're about to discuss right now, are we talking about when the person is tamei? We're talking about when, let's say, the frankincense is tamei. The chachamim say that you would be chayiv for that. And we just saw that they would say you'd be chayiv kares. Reb Shimon says that you would not be. And yeah, Reb Shimon says not. Now, you would also be, if you were warned, then you'll be chayiv makis, right? So if one were to eat frankincense in a state of tumah, which we'll discuss it now, and they were warned, so they would be chayiv makis. So now, Itmar, it was stated, Rabbi Yochanan versus Lakish, so we have two pairs over here. Sort of a Torah double date, if you will. The first pair was Reb Shimon and Rish Lakish. The other pair is Reb Elazar and Reb Yossi Reb Chanina. Now, one from each pair agree with each other, and then the other from each pair agree with each other. Okay. It's like hard to explain. It's an easy concept. It's just hard to explain it. So Itmar, Rabbi Yochanan versus Lakish, you have Rabbi Yochanan versus Lakish, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, you also have Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina. Now, Chad me'azuzah v'chad me'azuzah, so like one from each pair agree with each other, and the other from each pair agree with each other. So Chad Omar, okay. So now, one opinion is that machlokas, when the chachamim argue with Reb Shimon and say that Tumah does apply to inedible things, so they argue bitumas basar. When it comes to when the meat itself is tamei. Now, the pasuk by when the meat itself is tamei, I'm going to read the pasuk. It says, ve'abasar, the meat, ashiga b'chol tamei, that touches anything tamei, lo ya'achla, cannot be eaten, but it has to be burnt, ve'abasar, and the meat, kotar yochabasar, tar, people eat basar. So the question is, it already says basar at the end of the pasuk. Why does it need to say the basar at the beginning of the pasuk? So, and this is we've seen this drasha before, that the extra basar is to teach to include even things that are not normally eaten, like wood and frankincense and incense, etc. So the chachamim argue with Reb Shimon and say that you'd be chayiv for these inedible things, specifically when the frankincense itself is what is tamei, right? Like it says, v'abasar, right? So that pasuk teaches when the basar, or in this case the frankincense, is itself tamei. So you will be chayiv for eating that. So Chad Omar, so one opinion is that machlokas betumas basar, the chacham argue with Reb Shimon and say that you be chayiv for inedible things, specifically when I've been using frankincense as an example, so I'll continue to use that. When the frankincense itself is tamei, like the pasuk says, v'abasar, kol shar yochabasar, etc. It includes that. Avol betumas haguf, but the very next pasuk, which talks about when the person is tamei, but the frankincense is tahor. Now, there's no special drasha in that pasuk to teach about inedible things. Well, then divrei hakol eino loka. Everyone would say that there's no makis in that case. If the person is tamei and they eat tahor frankincense, they will not be chayiv makis because there's no drasha for that pasuk. V'chad Omar, but the other opinion is ki machlokas bazay kach machlokas bazay. The other opinion is that no, that the machlokas is in both scenarios, both when it's the frankincense that's tamei or when it is the person who eats it that is tamei. In both scenarios, the chacham would argue on Reb Shimon and say that you'd be chayiv makis if you're warned, or a chiyuv kares otherwise. Now, there's some stuff you can add to the Gemara. I'm going to add that stuff. I will tell you when I'm done adding this stuff. And the stuff is, Amar Rava says, Rava mistaver command Amar ki machleges bazoi kach machleges bazoi. That it makes sense, like the opinion that the Chacham argue with Reb Shimon in both scenarios, both when the frankincense is tamei as well as when the person is tamei, back in the Gemara. My time, how come they argue? What's the reason to say that they argue in both cases? Kevin de Karina Bey va'abasar asheriga b'chol tamei. Well, because since the Chacham hold of the drasha in the first pasuk of ve'abasar asheriga, and there's that extra basar to include inedible things. So Karina and Bey v'tumaso olav. So then we'll also say that this applies as well to the very next pasuk, which talks about v'tumaso olav when the person is tamei. The Chacham would argue in both cases and say that he would be chayiv for that. Rav Tavyomi Masni Achi. This is how Rav Tavyomi understood the discussion between Reb Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Reb Elazar, Reb Yosef, Reb Chanina. Rav Kahana Masni Achi. Rav Kahana teaches it like this: Chad me'azuzah v'chad me'azuzah aseifa. Right? Again, one from each pair agreed with each other, the other one agreed with each other. And aseifa, but they, instead of focusing on where the Chachamim argue with Reb Shimon, it's the other way around. It's aseifa, it's on the seifa as Reb Shimon, i.e., that where does Reb Shimon argue with the Chachamim, right? Meaning in the first way that we learned it, we're focused on where do the Chachamim argue with Reb Shimon, meaning, according to the first way, the Chachamim only argue with Reb Shimon when the frankincense itself is tamei, but when the person is tamei, they would agree with Reb Shimon that there would be no makas. Here it's the other way around, right? Aseifa, it's that where does Reb Shimon argue with the Chachamim? Right, so Chad Omar, one perspective is machlokes betumas aguf, that Reb Shimon argues with the Chachamim only, right, and says that there's no, right, that he's potter when we're talking about frankincense when the person is tamei, because since when the person is tamei, there's no drasha, right? That drasha from the first pasuk of Abasar, that's in its extra to say that it includes inedible things. So Reb Shimon would agree, okay, for when the frankincense itself is tamei, you would be chayiv for that. But the next pasuk, which talks about the person, Reb Shimon would say that there's no drasha there, and therefore the person would be potter. Aval betumas basar, but when the frankincense itself is tamei, which is the first pasuk where there's that drasha of the extra word drasha, divrei hakol loka, even Reb Shimon would agree with the Chacham that there would be chiyuv makas. V'chadamer, the other approach is ki machlokas bazo kach machlokas bazo, that the machlokas between Reb Shimon and the Chacham is both when the person is tamei as well as when the frankincense is tamei. Amar Rava, and says Rava mistavek mandama ki machlokas bazo kach machlokas bazo, and Rava says here as well that it makes sense, like the opinion that the machlokas is both in both scenarios, right? Both when the person is tamei as well as when the frankincense is tamei. My timer, how come? Kevin delo karina Bey v'tumaso olav v'nichrisa, because Reb Shimon would say that since in the second pasuk we would not say v'tumaso olav v'nichrisa, since in the second pasuk Reb Shimon would say that there's no chiyuv kares when the person is tamei. So then also in the first pasuk, Lo karina and Bey v'abasa sheiga b'chol tamei lo yoachel. So also then in the first pasuk, Reb Shimon does not hold that there's a chiyuv kares when, or makis, when it is the frankincense that is tamei. V'amar mar v'abasar labaseisim levona. But one second, but we had learned recently. Oh, it doesn't say, okay. Anyways, we had learned it recently that when it says, right, the drasha that we've been talking about, the extra word of Ve'abasar, it's coming to teach, to include things that are inedible. What does Reb Shimon do with that? So the V'sula Ba'ama, that's just Midar Abanon. Right? That's just Midar Abanon to say that it's possible, right, don't do it, but there isn't actually going to be a chiyuv kares or anything according to Reb Shimon. That drasha is just an asmachta, it's not actually Midar Oraisa, according to Reb Shimon. And now we get up to the final Mishnah of the fourth parak of Masechta Zevachim, which is also the final section of today's daf, that discusses the proper intention for a Korbin. As I mentioned in the introduction, it's a bit of a throwback to the earliest days of Masechta Zevachim, a little nostalgia, I'm sure. Here we go. This Mishnah was Taka quoted on the first daf of the Masechta. On Daf Beis and Beis says the Mishnah, L'shem shisha dvarim hazevach nizbach, for 6 things a Korbin is offered. L'shem zevach, l'shem zoveach, for the offering, for the offerer. Friends, does this ring a bell? Shinui kodesh, shinui bailim. Ha! Friends, do you remember that? Complicated stuff. Right? Cause azvachim shenizbuchu shalo lishman ksherin el shlo olu lebailim shem chova. That was the first Mishnah Masechta Zvachim. And shem bailim, right? Slaughtering a korban with the intention of doing zrikas adam for a different owner. Ooh, those were tricky sugyas. So a offering, a korban is slaughtered for 6 reasons. L'shem zevach, for the korban itself, right? A shlomim should be slaughtered as a shlomim. L'shem zoveach, for the offerer, it should be slaughtered for the actual owner, not for somebody else. L'shem Hashem, for God. We're gonna go one by one in the Gemara in a few minutes and go through these. L'shem ishim, for the fires of the altar. L'shem reach, for a shmek, for a smell. It should mamish smell good. It should smell good. We're going to see interesting nafkamina in the Gemara in a second, but it should smell like there's like a barbecue going on. L'shem nichayach, and that we'll see that in the Gemara bekilu nachas ruach lefanov she'amar v'naisis v'tzono. That the Rabbanim Shalom sheps nachas, that korbanos are being offered. The achatos v'asham l'shem chet. Now, when it comes to achatos, when it comes to an asham, you also have to have intent. You have to mind the sin that it is coming to atone for. Rabbi Yossi, if you remember this from Daf Beis, right? Remember on Daf Beis we were talking about default intentions for korbanos. We talked about gittin, we talked about korbanos, right? When you don't have any, what if you slaughter a korban chatas, for example, with no intention whatsoever? So it says Rabbi Yossi, af mi shelo aya b'libo l'shem echad mikol elu kosher. Says Rabbi Yossi, even if a person slaughters a korban without any of these intentions, the korban is kosher. Shu Tanai Bezdin, that this is taka Tanai Bezdin. Bezdin Dafka says and recommends that korbanos should be offered without any specific intention of any particular korban or anything in mind. She'ena machshava oleches achara oved, because ela achara oved. Here's the reason why. You have Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash, and they're busy doing lots of different korbanos for lots of different people. Now, even though the person bringing the owner of the korban, of course, maybe hopefully he has in mind the korban that he's bringing, and he's bringing the chatas, lavman chatas, but the kohen who's offering the korban might make a mistake or whatever it is, but he might have the wrong korban in mind. And the fact that the owner has the right korban in mind doesn't matter, because it goes based on the oved, based on the worker. I'm actually I'm learning, as you know, I'm learning Mishnah Yomi. I've been doing for a few months now. I highly recommend it. It just takes a few minutes, 2 Mishnahs a day. You get Gevaldige Bikiyas. Anyways, so we're learning now Mishnah Yomi Masechta Chulin. And it's interesting, this taka came up in the Mishnahs I was learning today about Shchita, right? If a person does, if a Yid slaughters an animal, just an animal, for meat, for an Ovid Kochavim, is it relevant that the Ovid Kochavim might be having in mind Avodah Zarah, even though it's the Yid doing the Shechita? But anyways, here we're saying that what's important is the person doing the Avodah, and therefore, even though the owner of the korban might have in mind the right korban, but the person doing the avodah might have in mind the wrong korban. So therefore, says Rabbi Yossi that actually you could just not have any intention at all. I think we learned in Daf Beis that would even be the recommendation, to have no intention at all. That way you don't have the wrong intent, to prevent having the wrong intention. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rab Ola, that when the pasuk says Ola reach nichayach la Hashem, Ola, when the pasuk says Ola isha reach nichayach la Hashem, so Ola is l'shem Ola, lafuka l'shem shlamim, right? If it's a korban Ola, you should have in mind an Ola and not a shlamim. Dilo, don't have in mind a shlamim. Isha l'shem ishim lafuka kvavo, that you should have in mind that you're going to burn the korban, the meat, on the mizbeach, on the fires in the mizbeach. Not that you're gonna I think it means not that you're gonna take it up there and make make your own coals and burn it on coals like a barbecue. I don't know. There's the pyres on the mizbeach that you're just gonna simply burn it on the mizbeach normally. Reach, when it says reach, a shmek, a smell, l'shem reach, it should be for a shmek. Lafuke evarim shetzlan vehelan delo, right? Meaning, so the good aroma of the korbanos is actually a very important part. It's one of the important parts of a korban. So, meaning the nafkamina is if you had already roasted the meat some other place, and now you're just going to bring it to the top of the mizbeach and finish burning it there, but it's not going to smell good because the smell was already when you burnt, it was already cooked. So it's not going to smell, so you're just reheating it. So no, you want to make sure that it's going to mamish smell like barbecue meat. It's going to smell givaldig. Damar V'Yudah Amarav. That says V'Yudah Amarav. Evarim shetzloin. Okay, fine. Evarim mutzloin. What am I doing? Amarav. Evarim shetzloin ve'elon ein boem mishum reach. That if you have the limbs of an animal that you had already roasted them, and then you bring them up to the mizbeach, they're not going to have that same givaldige shmek. Nichoyach l'shem nachas ruach. When it says nichoyach, that it should be nachas for the Rebbeinu Shalom, and lahashem l'shem mishar v'oya olam, that specifically should have in mind for the Rebbeinu Shalom, who said, and the world became. Amar V'Yudah Amarav, chatos sheshchoto l'shem ola psula. Okay, as we know already from the first Daf Masechta Zevachim that a korban chatos slaughtered as an ola is psula. L'shem chulin, however, kshera. But if you have a korban chatos that's slaughtered l'shem chulin, as just regular meat for people to eat for dinner, it will be kosher. Rabbi Elazar, my time in the Rab, Rabbi Elazar says, how come? V'leichalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael, kodshim mechalim kodshim vein chulin mechalim kodshim. Says Rabbi Elazar that from the pasuk of v'leichalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael, we learn that only kodshim can be mechal kodshim. So if you have a korban chatas and you have in mind a shlamim, another type of korban, that will ruin the korban chatas. But ve'ein chulin mechalim kodshim. But if you have in mind just, dinner, it won't be mechal the korban. The chatas will still be kosher. Mosiv Rabba, however, asks a question. Amar Reb Yossi, but Reb Yossi says in our Mishnah, Af mishlo hoya belibo l'shem echad mikol elu kosher. Shutanai bezdin. The Reb Yossi says that if you didn't have in mind anything at all, the korban is kosher. Taima shelo hoya belibo klal. It's kosher because he didn't have in mind anything at all. But if he did have something in mind, chulin, pasul. Some of the Abai says to Rabba, Dilma lo hoya klal kosher. Says Abai, well, maybe what it means is that if he didn't have anything in mind at all, kosher umiratz, the korban is, right? So Rabbi Yossi is saying if you don't have anything in mind at all, so not only is the korban kosher, but also it fulfills your obligation, right? If you had to bring a chatas, or if you're a nedava or something, you're yotze. But if you have in mind chulin, so the korban is kosher, but it won't be meratza. So let's say you have a korban chatas, and Rav is saying that if you slaughter a korban chatas, the shem chulin, it's kosher, but it won't. The korban is kosher. You can offer it at the mizbeach. The kohanim can eat the meat, but it won't be meratza. If you had to bring a korban chatas, you're still going to have to bring another korban chatas if the intention was for chulin. But if the intention was for nothing at all, then it's completely fine. You fulfill your obligation as well. Amar Belazar says, Belazar chatas sheshchata l'shem chulin kishera. That says Belazar a chatas that was slaughtered as chulin is kishera. Okay, right? You say I'm slaughtering this korban for chulin. It's kishera. Mishum chulin psula. But if he thought that it was chulin, if he thought that he was legitimately slaughtering chulin and not a korban chatas, psula. Well, then the korban is pasul kedeba mine Shmuel Ravuna. It's like Shmuel asked from Ravuna, minayin lemisasek bekachim shu pasul. How do we know that misasek bekachim? When you think that you're doing something completely different than what you're actually doing, how do we know that by kachim it is pasul? Meaning, if you're slaughtering a korban chatas, but you think it's something completely different, you think that you're just slaughtering dinner. So how do we know that it's pasul by kachim? Shene'emar, as the Pasuk says, "V'shachad as ben ha-bakar l'fnei Hashem, ad shetei shchita l'shem ben bakar." That it says that you slaughter the ben bakar, the shchita has to be in mind for a korban. Not that you're slaughtering something else. Amalei zo biyadenu he. Shmuel says that we already know this tradition. The akev minayin. How do we know that this is me'akev? That misasik by kochim is mamish posel. Amalei l'tzonchem tizbachu l'daitchem zibchu. That says right l'tzonchem to find favor slaughter, that you should do it with the proper. That you have to do it with the proper intention in order for it to be kosher. If you're misasik, if you think you're doing something completely different, for example, you think that you're just slaughtering dinner, well then it's going to be posel. Friends, that was Daf Mem Vav of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf Mem Vav of Masechta Zevachim, we learned about blood's exclusion from noser and tamei. That was, of course, from our Mishnah that we learned yesterday, that blood is excluded from noser and tamei. We learned the source from it, really first doing a deep dive into how do we know that blood is not relevant to me'ilah. And there were actually 3 relevant words to be learned from by me'ilah. There was lachem, there was lichaper, there was hu, and we say that each one actually is learning a different thing. One is excluding blood from me'ilah, the other is excluding blood from noser, and the other is excluding blood from tamei. We learned about inedible and impure kodesh, right? What happens when a tamei person eats kodesh that is actually not edible? It's not something that we eat. For example, frankincense. So the Chacham had said in our Mishnah, Osir. Reb Shimon said, Potter. We saw kind of different ways to understand that machlokas. Where exactly do they argue? Do they argue only when the frankincense is itself tamei? What about when the person is tamei? We saw different ways to break that up. And finally, the proper intention for a Korbin. We got to the final Mishnah of the 4th parak of Masechta Zevachim, and we learned about having the right intent, right, that you should slaughter a Korbin to be the right Korbin. We then saw the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, actually, who says that you shouldn't, right, that even if you don't have any intention at all, but I think on Daf Beis, Vidavka said that you shouldn't have any intention at all, it would still be a kosher Korbin. We then learned about what if you slaughter with the intention of chulin, that you're slaughtering this Korbin as chulin. We say it would be kosher, although maybe you wouldn't be able to fulfill your obligation that way. You would still have to bring another Korbin to fulfill your obligation. Friends, that was Daf Mem Vav, Daf 46 of Masechta Zevachim. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.